"Remove that thing from your neck, Mr. Hunt." The words sliced through the hushed courtroom like a knife. Judge Albright's voice carried the weight of authority, sharp and unyielding. To most people, it was simply the tone of a man used to obedience. But to Norman Hunt, seated at the defendant's table, it was just another order. One more barked command in a life already filled with them. Norman didn't flinch. He sat upright, his back as straight as if a drill sergeant still hovered over him. His hands rested calmly on his lap, the gnarled fingers motionless. The only thing out of place was the ribbon around his neck, a pale blue strip of silk adorned with 13 white stars. At its center hung a 5-pointed star, the kind that had changed lives, ended careers, and demanded reverence. The Medal of Honor. To the judge, it was nothing but a prop. "This is a court of law, not a costume party." Albbright sneered, his gavel cracking against the polished oak with a sound that startled even the bailiff. "You will remove that replica immediately, or I'll have it confiscated." The young public defender beside Norman Sarah Jenkins shifted uneasily in her seat. She leaned forward, her voice almost a whisper. "Your Honor, Mr. Hunt is 86 years old. He served in the United States Army. That medal has immense personal significance." Albbright slammed his hand on the bench, cutting her off. His spectacles slipped down his nose as he glared at the old man. "Do not insult my intelligence, Miss Jenkins. The Stolen Valor Act is clear. It is a federal crime to wear a military medal without authorization. That medal," he jabbed a finger at Norman's chest, trembling with self-righteous fury, "is the highest honor this nation can bestow, reserved for real heroes, warriors, men who bled and died, not for traffic violators parading for sympathy." There it was, the insult. A man who had lived through hell itself being reduced to a traffic violator. The charge against Norman was laughably minor, a rolling stop and expired vehicle registration. Hardly the kind of offense that demanded such fury. Yet Judge Albbright had found his stage. To him, this was an opportunity to display power. The courtroom was his arena, the spectators his audience, and Norman Hunt, his unwitting villain. The bailiff shifted uneasily. His name was Paul, a veteran himself, though his wars were far different. Iraq, not Korea. He recognized the ribbon instantly, even if the judge did not. His grandfather had told him about it, about the men who wore it, about the funerals attended by entire towns when one of them didn't come home. The thought of laying hands on that medal made his stomach twist. Still, he obeyed the nod from the bench and stepped forward. His boots echoed against the tile floor. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the judge's shallow breaths. "Sir," Paul said quietly, addressing Norman directly. His voice carried a note of respect the judges lacked. "Please don't make me do this." Norman's pale eyes finally moved. He looked at the bailiff, then down at the medal. His hand rose slowly, not in surrender, but in memory. His fingertips brushed the cool metal, and for a heartbeat the courtroom vanished. He was no longer in a sterile chamber of law. He was back in the mud, the freezing winds of the Korean peninsula tearing at his uniform. Gunfire cracked in the distance. The ground shook under artillery. A young soldier's lifeless weight pressed against his shoulder as he staggered toward a medic's tent. He could still smell the gunpowder, still hear the ragged cries of boys who hadn't yet learned how to shave. The ribbon had been placed around his neck in a blood-stained tent, not in a parade. The general's voice that day had not dripped with contempt, but with reverence. "The world needs to know what you did." Norman blinked and the courtroom returned. Judge Albbright leaned forward, mistaking the silence for guilt. "So you refuse to comply, very well. Contempt of court. Perhaps a night in jail will teach you the importance of rules." The gavel slammed again. But even as the judge reveled in his own authority, the storm outside those walls was already gathering. Somewhere in the back of the gallery, a young man in a tailored suit, an aide to a congressman, was watching. And unlike the judge, he knew exactly what that medal meant. This trial was no longer about a traffic ticket. It was about something far greater, something the judge had underestimated. Much greater forces were about to intervene. Norman Hunt did not move. His silence was not weakness. It was the stillness of a mountain, the quiet defiance of a man who had already survived the unthinkable. To the judge, however, that silence was insolence. Albbright leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "Men like you dishonor the dead when you play dress up. Decency alone does not make you a hero. And you, Mr. Hunt, are no hero. The words struck like a slap across the room. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sarah Jenkins clenched her fists at the defense table, biting back a retort. She was young, fresh out of law school, and painfully aware that crossing a judge could destroy her career. Yet her client was being publicly humiliated for wearing what she suspected was not a replica, but the real thing. The bailiff Paul hesitated, his steps faltering. In his chest, his heart hammered. He remembered the smell of oil and dust in Iraq, the desperate moments when brothers in arms shielded each other with their own bodies. He knew medals like that weren't props. They were bought with blood. "Paul," Judge Albbright barked, "confiscate it, now." The bailiff's jaw tightened. He took another reluctant step toward Norman. But before his hand could reach the ribbon, Norman's eyes drifted closed. And suddenly he wasn't in a courtroom anymore. The year was 1951. The place Korea. The sky was the color of lead, and the air reeked of cordite and frozen earth. Norman's platoon had been pinned down for hours near a rocky hillside called Heartbreak Ridge. The name was prophetic. Bodies already littered the slopes. The enemy's machine guns tore through the morning fog, shredding men where they lay. Norman had been 22, his uniform soaked in sweat and blood, his leg burning from shrapnel. Around him, the terrified remnants of his platoon waited for the inevitable end. But retreat was not an option, not with 30 lives depending on him. He had crawled through mud and wire grenades, clutched in shaking hands. He remembered the screams as he charged the gun nest, the deafening blast, as shrapnel peppered his skin, the way the enemy fire faltered just long enough for his men to regroup. When it was over, he had carried the wounded boy after boy back across the open ground. His shoulder ached from the weight, his ears rang from the endless thunder of artillery. Each life saved was a miracle wrestled from hell. In the field tent that followed, a general had stood before him. His uniform was stained with ash, his voice heavy with awe. For conspicuous gallantry, the general had said, his hand trembling as he placed the blue ribbon around Norman's neck. The metal had felt heavier than any rifle he had ever carried. That moment was seared into Norman's soul. It wasn't pride he felt, but grief. The medal wasn't his alone, it belonged to the boys who never came home. He was only the keeper. The courtroom snapped back into focus. Paul's hand was hovering near his shoulder, hesitant. The judge's face was flushed with fury, eyes blazing with the intoxicating power of unchecked authority. "So you refuse to speak," Albbright scoffed. "Then let the record show this man defies the authority of the court. I hereby add contempt of court to his offenses. Bailiff, take him into custody. A night in jail will remind this fraud of the meaning of rules." The gavel came down again, a crack of arrogance against oak. Sarah rose to her feet, her voice trembling with desperation. "Your Honor, please, this is unnecessary. Mr. Hunt is a decorated veteran. Surely we can." "Silence, counselor," Albbright thundered. His hand waved dismissively, as though sweeping her argument into the trash. "If your client wants to pretend he's some kind of war hero, let him do it from a cell." A murmur of unease rippled through the gallery. Even those who knew nothing of medals or wars felt the injustice suffocating the room. It was no longer about traffic violations. It was about dignity, about whether an old man deserved respect or ridicule. Norman remained calm, his gaze steady, his silence unbroken. He had faced worse than this petty tyrant. Bullets had not broken him. Fire had not broken him. The judge's words were just noise, a hollow echo against the roar of memories that still haunted him. Yet in the very back of the room, a pair of young eyes burned with outrage. The congressional aide in the tailored suit sat stiffly, fists clenched around his phone. His grandfather had been a Marine, a man who had once shown him a Medal of Honor encased in glass, speaking of it with reverence reserved for saints. And now here it was, hanging from the neck of a frail old soldier, about to be humiliated by a judge who didn't even recognize what he was looking at. The aide's pulse quickened. He knew what he had to do. He slipped out of the courtroom like a shadow, his phone already in his hand. The world needed to know the truth. And the judge had no idea that the tide was about to turn. The aide's polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as he slipped out of the courtroom. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the fire of indignation burning inside him. His name was Daniel Whitaker, 26 years old, fresh out of Georgetown, and serving as a junior aide to a state congressman. He had been assigned to observe a zoning dispute later that afternoon, hardly the kind of duty that usually stirred adrenaline. But what he had just witnessed inside Judge Albright's courtroom was no ordinary proceeding. Daniel ducked into a quiet hallway and pulled out his phone. His thumbs flew across the screen, searching the county docket. Norman Hunt. The name returned, results instantly digitized military record citations, grainy black and white photographs from the Korean War era. His breath caught. There it was in the archives of the Department of Defense Corporal Norman Hunt Medal of Honor, awarded October 12, 1951, near Heartbreak Ridge, Korea. Daniel scrolled furiously, reading the words that seemed torn from the pages of a war epic. Hunt had single-handedly silenced a machine gun nest, rallied his shattered platoon, and carried the wounded through enemy fire. 30 men had lived because of him. This wasn't a case of stolen valor. This wasn't a cheap replica. This was the man himself. The aide's chest tightened with anger. The judge wasn't just humiliating a veteran. He was humiliating one of America's most decorated heroes. Daniel hesitated only a second before pressing a number stored deep in his contacts. The call went directly to his boss's personal cell phone. "This had better be important, son," came the congressman's gravelly voice. "Sir," Daniel whispered urgently, glancing around the empty corridor. "It's happening right now. Judge Albbright is trying to have an old veteran arrested. His name is Norman Hunt, and sir, he's wearing the Medal of Honor. The real one." Silence, heavy, stunned silence. Then the congressman spoke, his voice transformed from political smoothness into the hardened tone of a man who had once commanded troops himself. "Say that name again." "Norman Hunt, sir, Corporal, Korea, 1951. The congressman let out a sharp breath. "Good Lord, get me the courthouse administrator and the state's senior military liaison. Now." The line went dead. Within minutes, the stillness of the courthouse began to fracture. Phone lines lit up. Clerks paled as they received urgent calls from offices far above their pay grade. The presiding judge of the Superior Court 2 floors above Albbright was interrupted mid-meeting. His secretary whispered the name Norman Hunt into his ear, and he stood so quickly that his chair toppled. Another call went straight to the governor's office, then routed again to a nearby military base. In the back seat of a black sedan parked outside, a major general read a briefing on his tablet. His phone buzzed. "Sir," one came the voice of the governor's liaison. "A Medal of Honor recipient is being threatened with arrest in Albright's courtroom." The general listened for less than 30 seconds before he snapped his tablet shut. "I'm on my way." His hand keyed the radio. "This is Major General Barrett. I need an honor guard detail at the county courthouse. Priority 1. Full dress. Now." Back inside the courtroom, Judge Albbright was still lost in his performance. His voice thundered, each word swelling with self-importance. "Bailiff, this is my final order. Remove that fraudulent decoration and place this man in custody. He is clearly unstable, delusional even. He'll be held for psychiatric evaluation until further notice." The gallery stirred uneasily. Sarah Jenkins gasped audibly. Even Paul the bailiff stood frozen, his conscience rebelling against the tyrannical command. He looked down at Norman Hunt, who remained calm, unshaken, as if the storm around him was nothing more than distant thunder. And then it began. At first it was faint, like the whisper of wind through the high windows, a low rhythmic chopping sound that grew louder by the second. Heads turned. Whispers spread. Helicopters. The unmistakable thump of rotors cut through the courthouse air, joined moments later by the wail of sirens. Not just 1 or 2 squad cars, but an entire convoy. The sound swelled, echoing off the stone walls until even the judge faltered mid-sentence. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Albbright snapped, pounding his gavel. But no one was listening anymore. Through the tall arch windows, they saw them 2 sleek, black military helicopters descending rapidly over the courthouse square, their rotors whipping trees into chaos. Below, a fleet of black SUVs and state police cruisers screeched to a halt, lights blazing red and blue across the marble steps. Doors flew open. Uniformed personnel poured out, moving with the kind of urgency and precision that left no doubt this was no routine visit. Inside, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. 2 state troopers strode in, followed by the presiding judge himself. but all eyes shifted to the man who came after. Tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform a mosaic of ribbons and service medals. His shoulders bearing the silver stars of a major general, he commanded the room without speaking a word. His boots struck the floor in perfect cadence as he approached the defense table. The air was electric, every eye in the chamber locked on him. Even Judge Albright's gavel hung suspended, forgotten. The general halted in front of Norman Hunt. His posture was ramrod straight, his face solemn. And then in a silence so heavy it seemed to press on every chest in the room, he raised his right hand in a sharp, perfect salute. "Mr. Hunt," the general said, his voice resonant with reverence. "Sir, I apologize for the delay. We came as soon as we were informed." For the first time that day, a flicker of emotion crossed Norman's face. He gave a slow, gentle nod. The tide had turned, and Judge Albright's world was about to collapse. The Major General's salute lingered in the silence, sharp and unwavering. Every person in the room seemed to hold their breath. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but the only sound that mattered was the quiet respect embodied in that single gesture. Norman Hunt slowly nodded, his pale eyes glistening with a restrained emotion. For decades he had carried the weight of that medal, not as a trophy, but as a burden. And now in this unexpected moment, the respect due to it had finally returned. The general turned his gaze, sweeping across the courtroom like a blade. When his eyes locked on Judge Albbright, it was as if the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Judge Want," the general said, his voice cutting cold as steel. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Albbright sputtered, his face red and mottled. "This is my courtroom. I demand to know the meaning of this intrusion." The general ignored him. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. Clearing his throat, he began to read, his voice filling every corner of the chamber. "Citation for the Medal of Honor, awarded to Corporal Norman Hunt, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, above and beyond the call of duty." The words were not his own, but history's. He read of October 12, 1951, near Heartbreak Ridge, Korea, where Hunt's platoon was pinned down by a superior enemy force. He described how Corporal Hunt had charged a machine gun nest alone, silencing it with grenades, then wounded in the leg and shoulder had refused evacuation, rallying terrified survivors into a defensive line. 30 men had lived because of him. Each sentence struck like a hammer, forging awe and shame in equal measure. The gallery listened with tears in their eyes. Sarah Jenkins clutched her chest, her own disbelief melting into reverence. Bailiff Paul stood frozen, his respect for the old man etched across his face. When the general finished, he folded the paper and looked again at the judge. "You did not just insult a man," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You insulted every man and woman who has ever worn this nation's uniform. That medal is not a trinket, not a costume, not a prop. It is a symbol of sacrifice, a debt this country can never repay. And you treated it, and the man who earned it with his blood, with contempt." The presiding judge of the Superior Court stepped forward, then his expression grim. "Albbright," he said curtly, "consider yourself suspended, pending a full review by the Judicial Commission. Get off my bench." The gavel that had been Albright's weapon now lay abandoned. The man who once ruled the room shrank before their eyes, his authority stripped away. Without a word, he shuffled through a side door, his career left in ruins. The courtroom exhaled as though a weight had lifted. For the first time that day, Norman spoke. His voice was quiet, steady, yet it carried to the farthest corners of the room. "He didn't know," he said simply. "Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with sadness. That is the problem. People don't know." He lifted the medal with one hand, letting the star catch the light. "Honor isn't in this medal. It isn't in the ribbon. It's in the remembering. That's all." His gaze drifted not to the judge's empty bench, not to the gallery, but somewhere far away. Back to a muddy hillside in Korea, to the faces of boys who had never grown old. His silence honored them as much as his words. The fallout was swift. Judge Albbright was censured, forced into early retirement. The judiciary mandated training for judges on military protocol and veteran affairs. A formal apology came from the governor's office, broadcast across the state. But the true change happened quietly. A week later, Norman sat at a small diner on Main Street, sipping coffee and reading the newspaper. The morning sun spilled through the windows, warming the worn linoleum floor. He looked like any other old man, ordinary, forgettable. The bell above the door chimed. In walked a man with hunched shoulders, looking far older than his years. It was Albbright. He froze when he saw Norman, then hesitated before approaching the table. His voice was low, almost broken. "Mr. Hunt, there are no words. I came to apologize face to face." Norman folded his paper, his eyes calm. He gestured to the empty chair. "Sit down." The two men sat in silence for a long moment. Then Norman spoke softly. "You were a judge for a long time. You saw a lot of bad. I imagine it makes it hard to see the good." Albright's eyes burned with shame. He could only nod. "Everyone carries a story you can't see." Norman continued, his tone gentle. "You just have to remember that." There was no anger, no lecture, just grace. A quiet act of forgiveness, as powerful in its simplicity as the general salute had been. And in that small diner, amid the clinking of coffee cups and the hum of morning chatter, a lesson deeper than any court ruling settled into the air. Because for every story of valor told, there are countless more untold. Heroes walk among us every day, quiet, ordinary, carrying burdens we may never understand. So remember them, honor them, never forget. And if this story moved, you share it. Let others hear it, because remembering is the truest form of honor. Like, comment, and subscribe to Veteran Valor so we can keep these stories alive.